Hello, I'm Joanne Taeuffer, one of the Healdsburg Museum docents. I'd like to welcome you to our online history talks. This series of talks was prepared by museum volunteers to be presented on Saturday mornings in the city plaza. Now you can hear them from the comfort of your own home. Today's talk is entitled Agnes's Excellent Adventure, and it's the story of my great-grandmother, Agnes Vanderwalker Congleton Wilson. Anybody with a name that long had to have had an interesting and perhaps complex life, and Agnes did. Agnes Vanderwalker was born on Valentine's Day in 1861 in Moscow, Minnesota. It was colder than you know what. This is the kind of snow they have in Minnesota in the winter. These people were standing on the cleared-out railroad tracks one winter in the 1880s. And this is a Minnesota cabin that was built in 1853. It's the oldest building in Freeborn County, where Moscow is located. And this was probably the kind of cabin that she was born in. Well, unfortunately, Agnes's mother, 39-year-old Clorinda, did not survive the birth. She died the day after Agnes was born. Agnes's father, Isaac, was left with 6 kids under the age of 13. And the family did not have a cow. Well, here's what happened next in the words of my great aunt, Helen Wilson, Agnes's youngest daughter.
And the reason these calls took my mother, it was 16 miles to the closest cow. And so consequently, and they had to go by horseback to get the milk. And when they went by horseback, why, the milk would not sour, but it would churn before they'd get back. So, anyway, why, Grandpa and Grandma Call had the cow, so they adopted Mama so she'd have milk.
And her mother had died.
Her mother died when she was born.
At birth, okay.
So Agnes ended up going to live with John and Mary Call, the neighbors with the cow. The story is that the Call family had one son, Finley, who was disabled. They had always wanted more children, but it hadn't happened. So Agnes joined their family, and it was a real blessing. There's no record of when Agnes went to live there. There's no formal record of any kind of adoption. But the deal stuck, and Agnes became Agnes Call. I don't know if it had to do with the weather or what, but as soon as the transcontinental train was completed to San Francisco, the Call family got on it and headed west. This was in November of 1869. Years later, Agnes would tell this story. At one point, the train was stopped and some people got on. It was a group of American Indians. Well, her mother, Mary Call, was terrified. She shoved little Agnes under the seat, covered her with a pillowcase, just because she was worried that something was going to happen. Of course, nothing did, but Agnes would tell this story many times throughout her life. By 1870, the Calls were here in Healdsburg. Agnes was in school, and her father, John, had set up a new boot shop where he was repairing and making shoes. 2 years later, they would purchase a 10-acre ranch out on Bellash Avenue. They purchased it from John Bellash, who had the property because he was married to Josephine Fitch, and the Fitch family were the ones who owned the whole Sodiomi Ranch land grant. The Call's property was right across the road from Fitch Castle, and they became friends with Anita, the youngest child, Josefa and Henry Fitch. Now, we know a lot about what went on in Agnes's life, and here's why. The newspapers of the day were just like Facebook. Every party, every event was recorded, and they tagged all the people who were at the events. So during the 1870s, Agnes was busy presenting short, dramatic readings and skits at various school and church events, and also attending parties. And in 1877 in particular, she attended an event that was quite notable. It was the May Day 1877 Knighthood Tournament. Now, this event was a revival of an event that was started by Roderick Matheson back in 1857. It was a medieval tournament, and the event continued for a few years, and then it had faded away until 1877 when it was revived. They had a king, that was the mayor of the Healdsburg, Captain Norton, and they had all these knights, and they were all dressed up in fancy costumes. They had gone to San Francisco to acquire these costumes. 6,000 people came to this event at a time when there were only 1,000 people living in Healdsburg. And they had tilting contests. So these knights were on horses with their lances trying to not spear one another, but spear rings that were hanging down. And the person who got the most rings won. They had a parade with a crowning of the May Queen, and they had hundreds of private luncheons because everyone had brought their lunch hampers, and at noon they got out and spread out and had a picnic. And the day closed with a grand ball at Powell's Theater. Now, this was always the way it was. There was always a big ball at the end of the celebrations. It started at 10 o'clock in the evening, and Agnes was one of the ladies in the beautiful costumes dancing to the Santa Rosa String Band. Another of Agnes's activities was as a member of the Lodge of Juvenile Templars. Membership required a pledge of abstinence from malt liquor, wine, cider, tobacco, and all forms of profanity. I don't want to be disrespectful, but I think they were focusing on the wrong vices. Agnes turned 17 on Valentine's Day in 1878, and within a few months she discovered she was pregnant. Now, there's only one way this is going to go, because it was the olden times. George Congleton was the young man. He was 20 years old. He was a well-known figure in town. He was known as a devil-may-care young buck, and he was at every party and every dance. The newspaper reported the wedding, and Agnes and George's daughter, Lula May Congleton, my grandmother, was born 6 months later, also on Valentine's Day. And over the next couple of years, the Congletons had 2 more children, John and Claude. But you know what? George was not cut out to be a father and a husband. He continued to attend every party in town, and Agnes was never mentioned as being there. His employment record was not great. There were big ideas, like a plan to take over E.B. McWilson's painting business, which were announced, and then they disappeared. And he kept having scrapes with the local constabulary. At one point, he got arrested because he refused to abide by the new 6-mile-an-hour traffic speed limit in town. And then instead of just paying the fine, he refused, and he ended up having to go to jail. Soon thereafter, he was arrested for resisting arrest in Petaluma. And meanwhile, Agnes began taking in seamstress work to keep the young family fed. They were living in a house on Piper Street, conveniently or inconveniently located near the saloon where George liked to spend a lot of time. The map shows Piper Street, and what is labeled Cloverdale Road is actually Healdsburg Avenue. They lived on this block of Piper, and the Ed Pruitt Kennedy Saloon, and house of ill repute, was where Sakeo is today. By 1885, George had left Agnes and the children, and he had set up housekeeping with a prostitute named Carrie there at the bar. Now, how do I know all this? Well, this is a spoiler alert. There's a divorce coming, and the entire transcript of the testimony from that divorce case was recorded by hand and is still available on microfilm at the county courthouse. My sister Jean, who did all the research for this presentation, has read the whole transcript, and all of this came out in the testimony from that case. It was hard to get a divorce in those days for women. There was only one reason you could apply for a divorce, and that was desertion. Nothing else. A man could apply for a divorce for adultery, not a woman. So Agnes had to wait a year. She had to scrape together the money to pay an attorney, and then she had to find George, who was in Santa Clara still with Carrie, and then she had to get the money together to pay the sheriff to give notice of the proceedings to George. Here's the summons. Finally, the divorce case could proceed. She testified on her own behalf, relating some of the stories I'm now repeating, and one of her friends, a fellow Pythian sister, testified on her behalf. One of George's friends also testified, saying that George, in fact, had been living with Carrie the prostitute and allowing that George's moral character was not so good. Finally, she was granted a divorce in October 1887. Unfortunately, her 7-year-old son John had died in August. She was 26, single, and with 2 children. She was ready to start a new life. So this concludes the reality TV portion of her story. But Agnes was resilient, and she was able to build a new life and become an active, vibrant member of Healdsburg society of the turn of the century. She moved home to the Calls Bellash Avenue ranch, where she would spend the rest of her life. To all accounts, she was able to integrate back into Healdsburg society without a problem. Maybe because everyone knew what her husband had done. Maybe because she had long-standing friendships with neighbors, other members of the Pythian sisters, and the family, including her husband's 2 sisters, with whom she would remain lifelong friends. Maybe because Healdsburg was the Wild West and not stuffy Back Bay Boston. And here she is back on the ranch. It was a hop ranch at that time. These are the hop pickers, and she was seated near the middle of the photo, wearing a striped shirt, holding a little dog. One of the things we've noticed about our family photos is that there's always a little pet with them. And the tradition endures into my life today. 3 years later, Agnes married Albert Allen Wilson. He was a 25-year-old who came from Oregon. He took over management of the ranch because her father was in decline and her brother was also not in good health. And the whole family loved Albert and welcomed him with open arms. In fact, my dad used to talk about Grandpa Wilson all the time, and Grandpa Wilson had died before I was born. But it was clear that this was one of my father's favorite relatives, so I'm going to call him Grandpa Wilson for the rest of this talk. In the next dozen years, Agnes's life reformed. Her children grew up, her son Claude went to San Francisco to work, and her daughter May married John Taeuffer, my grandfather, and moved to the Taeuffer Ranch on Magnolia Drive, where she would spend the rest of her life. And here they are when they were young. And in 1902, when Agnes was 41 years old, she was again surprised to find that she was pregnant. All went well, and Auntie Helen Wilson, was born. Helen would live on the Bellash Ranch all of her life. Here she is playing with a litter of kittens with her cousins. Dorothy and Ernest Taeuffer, those are May's children. Agnes's great-grandchildren. Claude Congleton, her son Claude's child, and Helen, who's the little girl in the front. These cousins grew up together, almost like siblings in an extended family. Meanwhile, the Wilsons' life revolved around typical turn-of-the-century activities, including their lodge. It's said that the first thing Agnes's father, John Call, did when he got to Healdsburg was to join the local Masonic lodge. This is not surprising. From the end of the Civil War into the early 1900s was the golden age of lodges. Wikipedia says about 40% of the male population belonged to at least one lodge. These fraternal groups had many functions. They were social. There were lots of parties and balls. They provided practical help for their members. The Oddfellows, for instance, provided insurance for their members. And they were philanthropic and also sometimes political. And they were everywhere. In Healdsburg, some were right around the Plaza. The Oddfellows building was and still is over on the corner of Matheson and Healdsburg Avenue, where Susan Graff and Brandt Insurance is. The original building was destroyed in the Great Healdsburg earthquake of 1906, sometimes referred to as the Great San Francisco earthquake. The current building replaced that original building. The Grange was on the corner of Plaza and Center Street in a building that was later the Redmonds Hall, home of another lodge. And this building was also destroyed in the earthquake and was replaced by the Farmers and Mechanics Bank, that beautiful Greek Revival building on the corner. And the Masonic Temple was and still is on Center Street in the Masonic building, and you can still see the door to the temple today. The Wilsons were active in several lodges, but the Pythian sisters and the Pythian Lodge would become their most important to Agnes's life and also her daughter Helen's life. This is a 1953 Pythian Sisters installation, and this is my Auntie Helen right here in the front row. Now there were lots of good times at the Pythian Lodge, but there were also good works. And one of the things that they did is that in 1924, the Knights of Pythias purchased a 100-acre ranch in Santa Rosa, right across from where Oakmont is now. And they started a home for elderly and disabled members. One of the people who lived there was Agnes's close lifetime friend and her ex-husband's 86-year-old Aunt Jenny Cook. Aunt Jenny was apparently a character that the whole town knew, and everyone called her Aunt Jenny. The members of the Pythian Sisters here supported the home. They raised money, they went to visit, and they started a project where they would preserve some of the fruit that was harvested on the ranch so that people would have it for the winter. Well, this was a big thing. In the whole county, all the Pythian Sisters lodges would have a competition to see who could put up the most fruit. And there would be articles in the newspaper saying this temple had so many quarts of peaches and this temple had more, this temple had less. Another organization that the Wilsons were involved in was the Grange, and this lodge was about educating farmers on scientific improvements in farming and also advocating for political change. The Grange was interested in regulation of railroads, supporting temperance, the direct election of senators, and women's suffrage. And the Grange was unique in the world of fraternal organizations in that it did not have any auxiliary. Instead, women were full members along with the men. Now, this makes perfect sense to me because I grew up on a family farm, and on a family farm, the wife is not arm candy. The wife is a partner in the business. And in fact, Agnes served as a steward at the Grange. Now, the Wilsons became involved with the Grange partly because Grandpa Wilson was interested in actions to try to gain economic power for farmers. He became part of a group of hop growers who were trying to put together tonnage so they could negotiate with the processors they were selling to. And once he became switched to prunes, he also did a similar effort in 1932 to try to raise the price of prunes, which had been tanking during the Depression. I don't know, it wasn't clear that any of these efforts were doing much, but Grandpa Wilson was still bound and determined to be a good and innovative farmer, whether or not he got rich doing it. He was farming the Bell Ash Ranch. In 1903, the family bought another 10 acres next to the 10 acres that the Calls had purchased in 1871. So now they had 20 acres. And what do you think these pictures are? These are all the things that were grown on that little 20-acre ranch. Healdsburg Tribune said the ranch was primarily French prunes, but also Jefferson plums, olives, pears, alligator pears, walnuts, chestnuts, apples, figs, grapes, sweet corn, potatoes, lilacs, and snowballs. Snowballs are those big, white, fluffy flowers that grow on a bush. The Tribune also discussed that there were local farmers who were rejecting traditional farming approaches, and Grandpa Wilson was noted as one who didn't really favor irrigation. He preferred to spread Petaluma chicken manure frequently. Now, I have some experience with chicken manure. I grew up on a farm out on Magnolia Drive, south of town, and Pete Isaiah, not to name names, used to spread chicken manure on his orchard regularly. Oh, P.U., it was so embarrassing because when we went home on the school bus, well, it didn't make a good impression on my fellow students. Grandpa Wilson also had experimented with rootstock. So in 1930s, he was noted as having had prune trees that were doing a really good job of resisting the oak root fungus that was a problem. And he attributed this to the fact that he had used root suckers to be the rootstock for his trees. And in fact, an expert came from UC Davis in the 1930s and bought some of his specimens to see if he could go back and figure out why Grandpa Wilson was having such good luck. I don't think he ever actually got cited in the literature for this, though. Now, things were different at the turn of the last century. There was no TV, there was no internet, but boy, were there dinner parties. Dinner parties would start with whist or Pedro or some other card game, and at midnight they would have a big supper. I really want to know, didn't these people have to get up in the morning and milk the cow? At afternoon gatherings, the musically inclined ladies would provide entertainment with voice, violin, and piano. And all these parties were documented in the newspaper with lists of attendees, often a combination of family, friends, and neighbors. This is a picture of the 80th birthday of my great-grandfather, Ernest Taeuffer, and he and Agnes are sitting right in front because they are the oldest generation here in the photo. This picture was with 4 generations of the Taeuffer family, May's family. There was lots of visiting back and forth, and there were people who had moved away, family and friends, who would come and stay for weeks at the 2 ranches on Bell Ash and Magnolia Drive. The Bell Ash family, John and Josephine, had moved away, and they returned for long visits. And the family that owned the home bakery in the Cruise building, the Grabners, had moved away, and they would come back and visit. And Agnes and Grandpa Wilson would also go to the Bay Area and stay with people. So Agnes and Grandpa Wilson also spent a lot of time going to the coast for camping and fishing at Bodega Bay, Jenner, and Tomales Bay. Starting in 1910, they were able to go in an automobile. They initially went with Mr. and Mrs. John Long, but ultimately they built a house out there and had their own car. The newspapers would say the Wilsons motored to Jenner and back home on a regular basis. When my sister Jeannie interviewed my cousin Mildred Farrell, who was a youngster when she knew Agnes, Mildred said all Agnes ever talked about was her lodge and fishing. Another important part of Agnes's life was sewing. Sewing had become really important to Agnes because while it had been the way she earned a living initially, she ended up having a love of sewing all of her life. She became part of the Busy Bees sewing circle. They called themselves Busy Bees because they had busy hands and they had buzzing conversations. Now I have a couple of very precious fabric items, artifacts from this time. This quilt was made by Auntie B, who was Nancy Brown, a longtime neighbor of Agnes's. And it was made on the occasion of my father's birth in 1916, because Auntie B had the same birth date, and the embroidery says, Auntie B, October 14th, 1857, to Norman T, October 14th, 1916. And this crazy quilt was also made on the occasion of my father's birth. He was a late life birthday for my grandmother, and I think it was an especially big family event when he was born. So we're pretty sure Agnes made this, and I look at this quilt and I imagine the dresses that all of those pieces of material came from, because she was known to have made beautiful clothes for all of her girls, and she ended up making a really beautiful, crazy quilt in the end. So there's a coda regarding Agnes's adoption story. In 1916, there was an article in the Santa Rosa newspaper. The postmaster had gotten a letter from Red Bluff, and it said, about 45 or 50 years ago, there lived a Scotsman named John McCall and his wife, and a lame boy about 15 years old, and a girl between 7 and 10 years old. The girl's name was Agnes. These people left Lansing, Minnesota for Santa Rosa, California, and we've never heard any trace of them since. This girl was their adopted daughter, and she was my sister. And it ended by saying, I'm very sick, and I'm very anxious to see my sister. It's signed Mrs. George Schofield from Red Bluff, California. Well, within a few months, there's another article in the newspaper that says Agnes and Grandpa Wilson had driven to Red Bluff, and that there had been a reunion with her sister, who had never forgotten Agnes. And at the end of the article it says, no doubt many reunions will be held by the two now that they know of each other's whereabouts. Well, unfortunately, the story doesn't have a happy ending because Agnes's sister did not live long, and in September Agnes was going to her funeral. But I kind of hope that maybe her sister Helen was pleased to know that Agnes's youngest child had the same name. So what about Agnes's family? Of her 4 children, her son John died in childhood, her second son Claude married, had one son, but then he died young in a work accident, and his son unfortunately also died young in a drowning. But her daughter's family stayed in Healdsburg and thrived. May on the Magnolia Drive Taeuffer Ranch and Helen on the original Call Ranch on Bell Ash Avenue. Members of both these families are still living here in town. Agnes Vanderwalker Congleton Wilson died in 1937 at the age of 76, and Grandpa Wilson lived until 1949 and died at the age of 86. They're buried at Oak Mound Cemetery along with Agnes's parents and all of her descendants, except those of us who are still kicking. So that's the story of Agnes's excellent adventure, and I think a life well lived. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this talk, please check out others in the History Talks YouTube channel, and plan to attend our in-person talks at the Plaza on Saturdays in the summer. I'll see you there.